journey of Advent ends with candlelight and silent night. It begins with the readings we just heard. So who's with me? Are you in for this journey? This may not be the obvious place to start. In some sense, we're beginning at the end, or at least the promise of the end. If you show up for Christmas Eve and the start of the story in Bethlehem, you are getting the most important part. But you're missing something too. If instead you begin this Advent journey with the longing for the Messiah and the coming of the judgment and the need for the coming of the judgment because the world is a mess, then by the time you get to the baby in the manger, you might be ready to say, could this be? Could this be the one? If you were to only show up for candlelight and silent night, for that very last part of Advent, and sing all is calm, all is bright, you might think that this religion is really about putting our heads in the sand, ignoring as best we can what this world is really like. You might think it is nice to take a break from all the chaos and crisis and sing carols for an hour. But then again, you might look around and think, oh, these people don't know what my life is like. Right? We're just going to pretend that all is calm. We know all is not calm in this world. But when we begin what is in some ways a discipline of Advent, we don't have to ignore that the world is in crisis. We can't, in fact, and we shouldn't. Jesus names it again and again. He is actually the one who won't let us pretend all is calm when it isn't. Instead, he names the fears and the things we may be afraid of and speaks into them a word of promise. The Son of Man will come at an unexpected hour, but he will come. We begin this Advent, this new church year, in the Gospel of Matthew. And the last words in the Gospel of Matthew are Jesus' words. Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He names the things we fear, and he speaks promise. He speaks promise so that we will not live in fear. Why? Because for one thing, he has too much for us to do. There are things that need to be done in the meantime, and fear will just get in the way. And also, I think he has such respect for us as children of God. He wishes us to have more dignity than those who live in fear. We are children of God. We live in hope. But he tells us so clearly, this whole chapter, Matthew 24, we just read a few verses of it, but it's a whole chapter of speaking about crises will come. Crises will come. And he names what probably ought to be obvious, but it is the nature of a crisis to be unexpected. This passage, it's one where it's hard to read it aloud and not do a little Bible study with you. I'll try to refrain today. Because it's a difficult passage. We hear Jesus speaking, we may not feel sure what he means. And honestly, this is one of those passages where when we think we know what he means, it may actually be getting in the way of what he's really saying. Just as one example, I thought about having you all do a show of hands, whether you think among the people in the field or the people grinding grain, whether you want to be among those taken or those left. It is not clear to me which group you should want to be part of. Taken by Jesus? Okay, I'll take that. But he says it'll be like in the days of Noah when the flood came. Taken by the flood? No, I'll pass on that one. Just what he means, I think he's not prescribing. This is how the judgment ought to be. In some sense, he's just describing the nature of crisis. This is what it's like. You don't see it coming. And he says that the crises associated with the judgment and the return of the Son of Man will in some sense be like the crises we've already experienced. And they always come unexpected. A life-altering injury everything was just fine until suddenly it wasn't. If you've experienced a miscarriage, everything was fine until it wasn't. You know, a natural disaster. Some these days we get a little bit of warning, but you all know, I'm sure, that a hurricane can take a sudden left turn or gather suddenly a lot of energy before it hits the coast. Earthquakes, they just come, you know. Those fires that were supposedly contained, all of a sudden the wind comes up, they're out of control. Whatever it is, everything was fine, and then suddenly it is not fine. So many things we can't anticipate, and so it is also with world events. You know, tensions rise, and we think we are at the brink of war. Will it come or will it not? We don't know. Will the political order hold, or will it buckle? We don't know. If we knew, everyone would be ready for every crisis that comes, but we don't. That's the nature of crisis. But Jesus doesn't want us to live in fear, but instead in expectation, in readiness, watchfulness, hope. When we think of the future, it's easy to feel the anxiety rise. It's easy to let our first thought be fear for what will come. But as Jesus' people, our first thought should be, as we think of the future, yes, Jesus has a promise for that. I'm with you always. In the 21st century, we may have our own special ways of living in fear. One issue we have that's the opposite of previous generations. Most generations, they just didn't have enough information to know what was really going on. We have too much information. We don't know how to take it all in. We worry about things we can't do very much about. And we don't know how to sort through it. What's important and what's not. What's true and what's not. Too much information puts us at the mercy of those who can make us afraid, doesn't it? Our ancestors may have been manipulated in their ignorance. We are in danger of being manipulated by the flood of information that comes upon us. But something else that is going on in our time, as we grapple with fear about the future, if you think about it, past generations didn't have a lot of control in their lives compared to what we have. Even just a generation or two or three ago, they would have loved to have a little more control, but they didn't. They simply had to either fear the future or somehow deal with that fear. We have some control. We have good health care. My goodness, what a gift. We have things like insurance. Forget about that, but it's nice to have. We have weather forecasts. Give us a fighting chance when something's going down. We have, Social Security, a little bit of different kinds of financial instruments. We have fire departments. Thank God. We have a global economy and networks of shipping. So if there's a famine somewhere, the food just comes from somewhere else. We've got air conditioning. The list could go on and on. We've just had Thanksgiving. Hopefully we've gotten an awareness of what we have. So much to buffer us from the different possible crises. So much to give us some control in life. You'd think we would be less afraid about the future. But that's not what I see, and that's not what I experience. Because in every area we have control, we're afraid of losing it. And in every area where we don't have control, well, we aren't used to that feeling, and we don't like it. And so we cling to those things we can control all the more. Do you see that in others? Sometimes it's easier to see it in others, right? In uncertain times, clinging to those few things I can control in uncertain times. But then, let's be honest, we can see it in ourselves as well. Instead of saying, the future, oh yes, Jesus has a promise for that, we cling to whatever it is we feel we have control over. But maybe this is not new after all. At the beginning of this chapter in Matthew chapter 24, the disciples begin this long teaching by Jesus by asking, tell us, Jesus, tell us when this will be. Tell us how this will happen. What will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? To say, give us some insider knowledge that gives us a sense of control. Give us a forecast. Would you give us a forecast at least? If you're going to talk about scary times, then please give us some sense of control in the midst of that. This need for control, where does it come from? I think most of us would love to have a deadline. If we're going to be asked to do something, tell me when it needs to be done, right? And I can kind of pace myself, make a plan, so I'm not caught off guard. I think for human beings, open-ended endurance is perhaps the hardest thing we face. I see this, when we face injury, when we face illness. If there's a sense that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right, you're going to be in a lot of pain, but for about 2 weeks, and each day it's going to get a little bit better. Oh, people can bear up under that kind of pain. But if it's, this may be with you for the rest of your life, and at some point it may get worse, that is a whole different scenario. Open-ended endurance. It's hard. And so we see the problem as our lack of control. We see our problem as our need to know, our need to be sure. But if we listen closely to Jesus, I don't think that's actually the problem. Because even Jesus says he doesn't know. One of the strangest words in Scripture, I think, for some, to read him say, I don't know the day or the hour. That's for the Father to know. I think this is what it means to be human. And if Jesus is truly human, then that not knowing is part of it. I came across a book. I haven't read it yet, but I love the title. Kate Bowler, theologian, got cancer, very serious cancer. She survived that bout with cancer and then wrote a book called No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Needed to Hear. Yeah, if we listen closely to Jesus, I think he's asking us to accept not knowing, and more than that, perhaps even embrace not knowing, and to live in the tension that brings. That's our Advent assignment. If you knew the deadline, you could put things off, or you might rush. If you knew how long you needed to endure, you might ease up too soon, or you might despair because of how much is still ahead of you. Instead, Jesus says, set that aside. Watch. Keep awake. Be ready. No crisis has ever come when it was expected. Many of you, if you were alive then, you will remember the fall of 1989, when certainly no one expected how quickly the Eastern European communist bloc would disintegrate and the Iron Curtain would come down. And you may remember that it began unexpectedly in East Germany, in the city of Leipzig, one of the major cities in the east of Germany, at St. Nikolai Kirche, the St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, one of the churches that Johann Sebastian Bach served back in his time. They had been allowed to keep a Monday evening prayer service, prayers for peace. And they would gather on Monday evenings using the symbol of what we heard in Isaiah, actually, the swords beat into plows. And the service on Monday night had grown. Many of the leaders of the resistance were attending it. Different groups that were active were attending it. It was growing, and so there was the question, when is the crackdown going to come? When are they going to notice this and decide that this was time for a crisis of violence from perhaps the secret police called the Stasi? Monday, October 9th, a large group gathered for these prayers for peace, and they had no way of knowing when they left that service if they would go out into, a police crackdown? But as they went out, they instead found that word had gotten out and thousands of others had gathered around the church, more than could ever fit inside. As dusk fell, they're carrying candles, and they met this procession coming out of the church and joined it. They moved through the city praying, some of them, many of them singing, a candlelight vigil through the streets, and thousands more joined them. Now it was the Stasi, the secret police, who were expecting a crisis of violence, so they built barricades around their headquarters, and the crowd came there, and they sang, and they left their candles. They came forward and left their candles on the stairs and on the barricades. A leader of the East Germans called Horst Zindermann was reported as saying in the aftermath, "We had planned for everything. We were prepared for everything, but not for candles and prayers." Advent is our time to live in the tension of this world, to tell the truth about a world in crisis, but also to hold out hope that peace is possible. To practice patience, to wait, to watch, yes, but also impatience with all that is wrong. An impatience that keeps us on our tiptoes in expectation and hope. A time to practice expecting Jesus with our whole hearts, to trust his word, to look to the future and have our first thought be, Jesus has a promise for that. But also to accept that his coming will be at an unexpected time and in unexpected ways, and to accept that we aren't in control of that either. We can and should look forward to Jesus' return. It is natural to wonder about it, and when we see the chaos of the world around us, we need to know that he will return. The promise is sure. But this need and desire for his return should always point us back to his birth as a child, his words, his death, and resurrection. The Messiah returning in glory won't be any different than the Lord who has already been fully revealed to us. And so after a look forward and a look back, the time to be faithful is always right now. To get ready, to watch, to wait, reminding ourselves and one another with songs and candles and prayers. A blessed Advent to you all.